windy day here in Cheshire, which means that the sound quality on this video will probably be rubbish. But I've just been thinking about the boundaries of science, which is, as I said in the last video, are the places where I think different kinds of poetics starts to assert itself, certainly in the language, but I think also in cognition, and becomes self-evident as poetry, and you know, the empirical status of the knowledge it conveys changes. What I mentioned in the last one was the temporal boundaries, and I just want to revisit that. You know, I think there was a time in the late 16th, early 17th century when science was just kicking in, really. I mean, there were precursors to it in going way back, I suppose, but people like Roger Bacon specifically. But you know, the scientific enterprise generally, I think, is acknowledged as starting in the middle of the 17th century. And we've only had it for those last couple of hundred years, really. And for me, what that is, yes, it's a series of practices, but it's also a way of thinking, a genre of thinking. And the way I'm configuring that is that genre of thinking is the poetic genre, and that, because I suspect that all cognition is kind of poetic. And that particular genre, which kicked in at the early 17th century, is marked by a kind of transition phase, I think. A moment when there was no genre called science, no genre of thinking, and certainly no genre of writing and expression and practice called science. So, and then subsequently there was. So it went through this weird transition phase, I think. And at that transition phase, it's marked by certain kinds of poetry. We're getting this weird boundary science language, boundary science practices. And I think someone like Newton, who is often held as the kind of paradigm of the early scientist, you know, I've also heard him referred to as not just the first of the scientists, but the last of the alchemists. A lot of his writing is absolutely alchemical and metaphysical, metaphorical, and ultimately poetic. It has that kind of ring to it. And the fact that it also contains things like the laws of motion and all the rest of the stuff that he was involved in is kind of, well, it's not accidental, but it's this strange blend of that kind of writing we call scientific, that genre of poetic expression we call scientific, and other genres that we might call religious, or we might call spiritual, or we might call whatever, but still a poetic genre. I think you also find that poetic tendency at the dawn of science with things like the heliocentric model of the universe, or the heliocentric model of the solar system. When that was put together by Copernicus and all the rest of those guys, early models of it had the orbits of the planets around the sun as circular. And it wasn't, I think, until Kepler came along with the idea of elliptical orbits that the math started to make greater sense. But there was this great tendency, I think, to believe that these orbits were circular. And the only reason I can think of for wanting to have circular orbits is because of a kind of poetic affection for roundness, and an aesthetic appreciation of the circle as having a particular kind of symbolic resonance, and a need for those orbits to be circular. Ultimately, as I say, grounded in a poetic, which is different from scientific poetics. So I think that, and those are just a couple of examples, but I think those mark that strange boundary phase between non-science and science that exists in that moment in time. I think the other edge, here comes the wind. I'll get over to this hedge, perhaps I can find some shelter. The other end of the temporal boundary that science occupies, obviously, is right now, this moment in time that we seem to be living through. I think you also find that poetic tendency with frontier science, the leading edge of science, the cutting edge, the bleeding edge, all those kind of metaphors of science that's happening now, that is in a state of just coming into being, if you like, possibly. And And I think at that moment, when science hasn't been fully incorporated, hasn't been fully explored, hasn't been fully fleshed out, and become part of the body of science, it has this kind of poetic status. And so you get terms like dark energy and dark matter and black holes and all those strange terms that revolve around quantum physics and complexity and strange attractors, all that kind of language, which, you know, quite rightly is said to be a placeholder. They're acknowledged that they're not real scientific theories, they're placeholders that ultimately it's hoped will be, as I say, fleshed out and become part of more substantiated forms of understanding. But at the moment, before they're incorporated in that way, they are still being talked about. And the way they're being talked about is through this other genre, this weird kind of syncretic genre somewhere between scientific language and other kinds of expressive forms and cognitive forms. So as I say, I think science as a practice is a genre of poetry, and we don't recognise it as a genre of poetry because of it kind of disappears. Its self-evidence disappears, but it becomes evident at its boundaries where other kinds of poetics assert themselves. And the boundary I've just been talking about is the temporal boundaries between 16th, 17th century and the present moment.